You've been at the trial of Ruth Lawrence for a double murder in 2014 for the last 2 days, Eamon, and we've heard from probably the most significant witness yet. This is a woman who knew Ruth Lawrence at the time. Tell us about this witness.
Yeah, so we had Stacey Symes, and she was referred to in the opening statements, and she's been referred to by other witnesses as herself and her father were kind of small-time drug dealers in Ballyjames stuff, selling weed to people who called to their house and people who text her. And she was doing her post-leaving cert course in college in Cavan, and she sold to a couple of people there as well. And so she was kind of taken through. She was described in court as being the most substantial witness so far in the case. And she kind of takes through the events this all happened on kind of Easter weekend. So the Good Friday, there was a trip to Dublin. Owen O'Connor turned up at her house. One of the victims is Owen O'Connor on the Monday. On the Tuesday, then they knew that people were trying to contact Neville, and they hadn't heard from him. Went on the Wednesday and realised something terrible has happened. So this has all kind of gone through in court, that they kind of basically drove to Rosslare, the four of them, Ruth Lawrence, the accused, her then boyfriend, Neville van der Vestes, and the two Symes. And they basically stayed a couple of weeks in London before they came back, while Ruth Lawrence and van der Vestes went to South Africa.
So evidence, it's so significant because she details conversations that she claims she had.
Yeah. So there's a kind of a lead up to it, but essentially it's down to her saying that Ruth told her that she had shot Owen O'Connor.
Yeah,
and that Neville had, and that they were told then that Neville had finished him off. And this was on a night it's the Wednesday. Now she referred to those couple of days as one long blur. She talked about not necessarily having a good time scale in her head, but was adamant that that both Neville and Ruth had spoken about what had happened, and that and even the fact that they were asked to move bodies. But if we just go back and kind of maybe take it in stages, in the kind of the way it transpired in court, it's just kind of, it might be easier to follow because they did kind of do a chronological order.
Yeah.
So basically, look, she was asked to kind of explain who she was a bit. Like she's now 32. At the time, she was 19 or 20. She was originally from Frigus, but grew up in the country. Went to school in Castlemartin. Lived around Cavan. And she had first got to know them when she first had heard of Neville and Ruth when her father bought a car off him one time when she was about 14. She remembers Ruth Lawrence, arriving with Neville at their house one time, and that they were living in a different place. The Patrick's Cottage is where, for the purpose of this court case, they were living at the time. She remembers, having conversations with Ruth. She told her that she was a tattoo artist, and they talked about tattoos. And then later on, as she was older, like they were basically taking 2 ounces a week of weed off them, and they were selling at small amounts. That's about worked out. It's 56 grams apparently. Sometimes people would come to the house. Sometimes she'd sell in college, and she generally didn't make much money. There was nothing special. €25 for a gram. So maybe herself and her father were generating about €1,300. But she says they didn't have, her father didn't have appear to have any excess money. And that, he was spending it himself on weed as well. At the time, she was driving a Nissan Micra. Now, we heard from, in her cross-examination, this had been a present for an uncle, and it helped her, go to college. She said, actually, as well, that, she had finished she got her leaving cert. And since all these events in 2014, she'd since done a degree, and she actually got a master's. And she said, like, she'd regularly she'd use it to go to her boyfriend's house in Cavan. Also to pick up her little sister Jasmine, who was only 6 at the time, from Finglas, for whatever weekends, as she said, whenever they could get her, they'd bring her up to Cavan. But also then she would drive her dad to various places as well. He wasn't driving, and this brings us to a kind of a meeting where she was asked to go to a pub with her dad. And she thought they were there to listen to music. She said she thought that, she remembered that Ruth and Neville were there. And this man that we're referring to as CD was there as well. And that there was a discussion about robbing someone's drugs, but she wasn't sure exactly, when this discussion took place. She has a memory of it.
Now, we've heard CD is the name given to him, is obviously not called Mr. CD, but...
but that's how we're referring to him now.
And he has been described at various points as effectively being the wholesaler who was providing drugs for Neville and Ruth Lawrence.
Yeah, and it kind of made the introductions in terms of Owen O'Connor was introduced to Neville by this man.
Yeah.
And so Ruth in her evidence says that the person who she was asked who was to be robbed, she said it was Owen someone. And she was asked, was there any reason behind this? And she mentioned that there was some kind of, that somebody wanted some kind of retribution against them. And then she was asked about any other trips to Dublin. And she talked about how one time she went and met an individual called Paul. This is before the Easter. And she went with... Neville picked up a gun, she said, and that a man came to the door of the car, and she couldn't say exactly where this was. Her father was with her, and this man came over, handed a bag, and went off again. And she didn't know, again, like I said, she didn't know where this was, exactly what part of Dublin, she said, and that Neville was in the seat beside her. I think she was driving, and the bag was on his lap, and she heard this clicking noise, and he said it was loaded, and she didn't see it properly, but she understood it was a gun. And then... she said during that that drive back, the idea of stealing the drugs came up again. She was asked then how many times, she had met Owen O'Connor, and she says, it was once in her house, and this, as we'll find out, is the Monday before he disappeared. And other times it was simply dropping something or, through a window, but she'd met him 3 or 4 times. And that night when they got back from Dublin after picking up the gun, she said Neville van der Westhuizen took it apart and cleaned it and showed it off. And she was asked, was there any more discussions about guns? And she says, not with her. So we're on to now April the 18th. That's the Good Friday. And they drive up to Dublin again in her little green Micra. And she describes there being a lot of waiting around. She's a bit vague about exactly where she was at times. She couldn't quite remember. And she realised at one point that they were following another car. They indicated they pulled in near a church. And this is somewhere around O'Connell Street, she said. There was a man and woman in it. They were waiting for a while. Then Ruth and Neville appeared, she said. And Neville wanted the car from him, so she gave it to him. And she was surprised. She was a little bit concerned about it. And he went off. They were gone for a good while. And they were waiting with her dad. And dad was getting fed up or freaking out, I think is the phrase that she used. And they were waiting in Burger King on O'Connell Street. And they rang Ruth Lawrence to say that Burger King was going to be closed in a couple of minutes. And they said they were on their way back. So they headed back for Cavan then that evening in the Green Micra. They stopped at Blanchardstown to let the Ruth and Neville get their own van, which was locked into her car park. They had to find the security man. And there was a couple of bags now in her car that hadn't been there before. Actually, a guard turned up at one point. But anyway, they got their car out. And then they went back to their cottage. This is Patrick's cottage, Ruth and Neville's cottage, and she could see what she thought was cocaine, bricks of white, as she put it.
Yeah.
And she said they may have stayed there for a couple of hours, 6 or 7 hours like that. She went home and the window was smashed. And we heard this before from Sean, her brother's statement that he had smashed the window. And so she kind of they're going through these details, I think, to try and date exactly when things happened, and that everybody's statements are aligned, or so that it's the jury are able to see that the chronological order. So the Monday morning is the first time she sees Owen at her house. She was standing at the fridge. He said he needed to see Neville. Neville was on the phone and he was kind of stonewalling where he was, exactly where he was. She described Owen as lovely. He was just a nice guy.
So I mean, underlying all this is Owen O'Connor's attempt to collect I think it was 70,000 was described as a debt.
Yeah.
A drug debt.
Yeah, and this, yeah, exactly it. And again, like the Symes owned 15,000, but as Ruth will say in the cross-exam, this was money that they owed to Neville. So in a way, I suppose it was the money that was owed up the line as it works in these things.
Yeah.
So, like she said, Owen seemed happy enough. She wrote down his contact details. She didn't have them previously. And so she kind of goes through about like what she did. She dropped her sister home, I think, on the same day, and the next night she'd gone to her boyfriend's. And she's kind of explaining that generally, if she was doing a trip to Dublin, like to drop off her sister, I think I mentioned this already, that Neville would jump on the bandwagon, so to speak, and say, "Can you pick up stuff?" And so on the Wednesday, then they went to Neville's house because they had tried to call them and they couldn't get through to them, and they said, look, they were kind of friends, so they more or less went to check on him. And she was asked, like, well, what did you see when you went into the house? And the first thing she saw was a foreign man, as she said it, somebody who's really hyper, like he was on speed or something. She said they all were. And there was Ruth, Neville, and the foreign fellow were there. The foreign guy, as she put it, freaked out. He grabbed a machete and started flying around with a machete, saying that they were going to ring the guards, i.e. The two Symes. And then at this point, to add to the confusion, her brother rang to say that there were people at his house belonging to Owen. And then there was, shortly after that, a call from the Gardaí looking to speak to her father as well.
Right.
So this is all happening while they're in the house. And this is where she says, they told me he was dead. Who said that, she was asked? And she said it was Ruth and Neville. They were on the other side of this table. They were speaking over each other. They were very hyper, or hypey, as she put it. They were both trying to talk. There was a lot coming out. And she remembered that her saying that she had shot him, but it had gone wrong. He had twisted. And then in the cross-examination, she kind of demonstrates this little bit of a kind of a bodily movement. And if you want to, later we'll come back to what Dr. Mary Cassidy said, that that there was 3 bullet wounds. There was 3 bullet wounds, but it was possible that only 2 shots were fired. Anyway, they decided that he was going to go see the guards. This is her father. And when they came back, then the foreign guy was gone. And she was asked, like, while you were in the guard station, what did you do? She says, I was just waiting for my dad. And then they went back. There was another discussion. She was asked about Owen O'Connor, and they told her that they'd put him them under a tree, one on top of the other. She didn't exactly say where it was, but she was indicating as she sat, and she was indicating behind her, which suggested towards the water. There was mention of a ledge and that they had to swim, and left him under this tree. And there was a discussion about Owen O'Connor and his car. And she said, well, whatever it was Ruth Lawrence. It was the one who was going to put the car wherever they wanted it and leave his phone in it. And she said she wasn't asking any questions. And there was a comment made that Anthony Keegan had died from, and then again on the cross-examination, Patrick Gageby asked her about this, and he asked her, like, was it Ruth Lawrence who said that that Anthony was willing to kill for Owen, and she agreed with that.
Yeah.
So it was anyway. And she said at some point then Ruth was showing off a gun to her. Like it was cool to have a gun, and she showed her how to load it. And again, she was asked, was there any more discussion about the bodies? And they were asked to help move them. And she said they were under pressure, they were under trees, and they wanted to move them by boat. And she said it was supposed to be me and Ruth on the boat, so if somebody saw them, it would just be 2 girls. And her dad said that he'd get sick, and I just shook my head. Dad said he wouldn't be able for it. And they stayed in that night in the cottage, in a little bedroom, and she was asked, did you sleep? And this is where she says it was just one long whole day. The next 4 days, the whole 4 days were just one long day. And so they arranged then the next day to get a boat off somebody. She was asked about her state of her mind. She said, I don't know. I didn't know whether it was coming or going. I didn't know what was going on around me. So they said at one point, like, they visited Neville's father. She wanted to get her father's medication, and so they went back to her house, and she said she says she wasn't thinking straight. She doesn't know why she did it, but she balled up some dirty clothes that were in the laundry for herself, wrapped them up in a sheet, and she took all the paperwork for her room, which she says, I don't know why I did that. They were back at the cottage then, and there was their dogs. She described it as a pit bully, a white boxer, and Stacey had her own dog as well. So there was 3 dogs, and so they went to a friend's house and just put them over the fence and left them in the back garden.
So they're obviously coming under pressure at this point from all angles, in particular from the associates of the 2 missing men.
Yeah, and we get a lot of that in the cross-exam, where she kind of talks about, she felt under threat, and it was the first time she'd ever had a threat against her, and a death threat, as she felt at that time. So the guards were onto him again. So they ended up going to Navan Garda Station this time, and the 2 women waiting in a fast food restaurant. Now, we heard previously Garrett Evans about taking phones off them. She was asked about that, and she talks about she thinks Ruth at one point went into the toilet. She had a small bit of cocaine and got rid of that in a SIM card, and she already had gotten rid of her own mobile phone. And then they got as far as, she had to get her passport as well. It was one of the reasons she went back to her house as well. And she had something like the €100, I think there was 50 put aside for her car insurance. They didn't have any money, more or less. And in Rosslare, she's explained that Neville got someone to come down and I had to get out
because
and
we've heard
collect it.
before, of course, in other evidence, how they got the ferry from Rosslare and ultimately left the country, and Neville and Ruth Lawrence would end up in Africa. But she gives more details, I suppose.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. So they get through. I mean, it is, even her boyfriend, she said, was going mad, as she put it, because everything was going awry, and she didn't speak to him properly at that point. She was asked, but they got on the sailing anyway to Ross. It was Pembroke, because we'd mentioned Rosslare before, but I think we had a person who had the manifest from Irish Ferries had said Pembroke. But anyway, they're referring to it as Rosslare. They made their way to London. Oh, sorry, Rosslare to Pembroke rather than Fishguard. Excuse me. Sorry. So the Irish port is Rosslare to Pembroke, and then on to London. And there was there were about 5 days there, 3 to 5 days, she says. It was somebody that Neville knew, living in a block of flats. She said there was no more real discussion with them, not in front of her. He says it was weird. They weren't included in everything. Things had changed. They were starting to have conversation behind closed doors. They were selling the BMW and going to South London. Then he says they were gone at one point. She said herself and her father, they were lost a bit. They didn't know what to do. They had to leave. And she said she'd never been in that kind of a situation before. They got dropped at a homeless shelter, and another 4 to 6 weeks before they eventually decided that they'd come back to Ireland. And part of that was because relatives had told them that people were being threatened, and they went back. They went back to Ireland, and so that was the end of the evidence yesterday.
Now, she obviously continued on, did she? And she was obviously cross-examined then by the defence, who I suppose they were posing questions about how she ended up deciding to be a witness, because it is still uncommon for in trials of this nature for to be witnesses of that type.
Yeah, and there is, I suppose, an explanation of sorts. I mean, luckily enough, they started off again with the biological stuff, and she was asked exactly how do you pronounce your name? Was it Symes or Sims? Because you've been referred to as Sims a lot of the time, but it's Symes. And again, goes through, he asked her about, did she finish her college course? And she did, and she was doing a small amount of dealing at the time. It was just you and your dad. You had your social welfare was the main income. She said they'd sell enough to kind of cover your own use of weed, and then a bit for clothes. She said she didn't want to be selling weed. There was no other way. She mentioned that they wanted to get back on their feet. She was asked about kind of, I suppose a lot of people must have known that you were selling drugs. She says, I don't know. She says a lot of people called to the house. They use it as a party house. There was a mention of being cuckooed, which is this idea of people moving into your house. Yep. And she mentioned Spider, who was a man who gave evidence earlier in the trial, stayed there a couple of months. But her father was in charge of the money. Again, she was asking about kind of going on doing the various trips with Neville, or doing trips for him, and she said yes. And then she was asked about, look, you were given the option of alternative accommodation. You don't live at, this estate in Woodlands anymore. And she says, no, I don't. There was other accommodation found for you. I don't understand the question. So there was a bit of back and forth. I think there was a little bit of cross purposes there. And she agreed then that, she now lives in a different address, and that they were assisted in that by the state, that her rent is paid and that her education is paid as well. And she was asked then, so do you live in a modest lifestyle? And she says, no, a normal lifestyle. And that she's done a third level course as well. She's done a master's in psychology, and there was another aspect to that as well. I didn't quite catch it. And then she was asked to go back to 2014. Had she discussed it with her father? She said, not very much, maybe twice. And she said, when was the last time? Maybe a month ago. And yes, she still lives with her father. She says he is working at the moment. And she was asked when the last time she spoke to him, and she said last night. And she agreed that she had told him that she couldn't discuss what evidence she'd given. She was asked about when she started smoking weed. Was your dad fond of a smoke? And she said on and off. And she was asked, did she ever take drugs? She said maybe cocaine about 5 times. She never took speed. Dad wasn't into speed. She'd snorted cocaine with her dad. She was asked, and she said, well, she'd done it 3 times in front of him. just on 3 occasions. Now, there was an issue where clarity was brought up. Tony Hunt, the judge, mentioned this, that, she wasn't, sometimes she was saying things, she wasn't quite audible. And so there was a little bit of moving around to get the microphone working correctly. It certainly wasn't her fault. And then this is where she mentioned, that there was money owed, but she said, we didn't owe him any money, not to Owen O'Connor. We owed the money to Neville. And she said, she agreed he seemed to be grand. He was looking for Neville when he called that time. And then, again, she mentioned, they didn't have any worries, but they checked on their friends, Ruth and Neville, because as she put it, people looking for money for drugs can be quite intense about it. And then again, on the night of going to Cavan Garda station when the men were summoned, she talks about it, it blurred into one long time. And she remember it was dark, so it was nighttime. And she was asked, when they got back to the cottage after that, what were you doing? And she was talking about, she was asked to smash up cups and throw stuff in the fire, take stuff out of the fire. So you were cleaning up. And she said, I didn't realize that was what was going on at the time. I thought the foreigner had done that. So you did the cleaning? And she says, yes. She says, I didn't understand what was really happening at the time. I got really scared. He said her dad was scared too. He was doing what he was told, and that was cleaning up. And she said yes. And she said directly it was either die or do that. So she was very much putting across that she felt in a lot of fear at that stage.
And did she describe anything about her, how she got on with Neville and with Ruth during this time? Or
well, yeah, she mentioned that she felt that Ruth was the more dominant person, and that she was asked then, by the time they got to London, she said Ruth rang them and told them they had to get out of the flat. And she was asked well, you didn't expect this lady? And she says, no, we didn't. But that was the way Ruth would speak to you. It would be an order. Whereas speaking with Neville, there would be kind of more of a negotiation about it. Yeah. So you get that little bit of a sense that she got on possibly better with Neville than Ruth, certainly at this time, which she kind of, she felt that she was she was under obligation to carry out this, and even going to London wasn't necessarily her idea, that she felt she was being forced to do this. And this is what she said. And she was asked about, while she was waiting in Cavan Garda station the first time, she said you didn't say anything to the guards who would have been in and out of the station, and she didn't. And she was asked then, you didn't say anything to the guards when you were in the fast food restaurant in Navan as well, after your father being questioned, and she said she was afraid, and she was afraid for her family as well.
Yeah. So did her father is also due to give evidence? Did he appear today or?
Yeah, we had a brief appearance. He was due to get going, and it was being done by video link.
Yeah.
There was no explanation to the jury as to why it was video link. It's quite normal. It happens in a lot of cases. It's nothing untoward. And when they were basically swearing him in, there was a little bit of difficulty. He had a bit of difficulty in following the registrar leading him on the oath. The usual one, they undertake to tell the truth and so on. And the judge intervened at one point, just repeat what the registrar is saying. And it gradually became clear that there was a problem with the link. Although we did hear that, he was 55, originally from Dublin, born in Finglas, lived in Dublin for 28 years. And then they realised that, the link was freezing and cutting out. And so basically they waited for a while. The jury were sent out. Then they were called back in and said, look, it's going to be done tomorrow.
And earlier yesterday we heard from Dr. Marie Cassidy, who obviously the former state pathologist, who I suppose she carried out the autopsy, and she described some of the bullet wounds, basically, that ultimately cost these men their lives.
Probably Ireland's best known pathologist, now a novelist. So the former chief state pathologist, Professor Marie Cassidy. She held that position for a number of years, I think 35 years working in the field. She retired in 2018. Again, we get this with all pathologists who are asked to go through their qualifications, and again explains that she was given a kind of a background to it. She was doing the autopsy, the post-mortem on Owen O'Connor. Now, her colleague Michael Curtis carried out the one on Anthony Keegan. So she talks about exactly what's there. He was wearing a blue Hallie Hansen jacket zipped up. He had a Chelsea shirt underneath, a grey tracksuit bottom, small hole at the waistline back and front, and the boxes had similar holes and blood staining around them. And she mentions kind of a tattoo of boxing gloves and a heart with his partner's name inscribed on it. So, that was there as well. So she said there was three wounds identified. So she carried out the various the various checks. They do all the internal organs and things like that. But the bullet was recovered from the skull cavity. She again demonstrated this. The bullet went through the left earlobe and it went from left to right through the thick bone behind the ear. There was damage to the mandible, which is the jaw, I think, and the tissues lining the skull. But due to the decomposition, we couldn't really see the damage to the brain. But the bullet was recovered. There was another abdominal wound just to the side of the stomach button, your belly button, rather.
Yeah.
There was a bullet through the pelvic cavity. So this is the same bullet, and it exited to one side of the spine. There was a small regular hole. So they were kind of the two kind of main injuries.
Yeah.
And then there was the third injury was the left index finger. Through the top of the finger, there's a gaping hole. And and two other fingers were damaged, perhaps grazed as the bullet crossed into the other finger. And there was, I think, she mentioned that the bullet that was recovered in the skull was badly damaged. So she went through, she kind of demonstrated this, and explained it in clear language, I think, to the jury as well. The toxicology, very low levels of alcohol, and just he had some decongestion, like, something you'd take for a cold or whatever. Now her conclusion was that the head wound was a fatal injury. The stomach was a potential fatal wound. The finger shot, she said, could have been caused by one or other of the bullets either entering or exiting. And again, they were likely wrapped up in this. It was a sleeping bag he was found in pretty soon after death. And she was asked about, it could have been, is there any way you could tell which bullet was fired first? And she suggested that due to the bleeding that came from the stomach wound, that the evidence was there, that it was more than likely that the stomach wound was the first shot.
And obviously this evidence is being given, as part to see if it matches. It'll be tested if it matches with some of the other statements.
Yeah.
There.
Well, it's certainly, it's an explanation as such, for the third wound, like was there two shots or one shot or whatever.
So, Mr. Symes, that's the final pronunciation. He'll be back up tomorrow?
Yeah. So Jason or Jay Symes is due back tomorrow. The jury were told that they'll be back tomorrow.
Yeah. So we'll
just have to keep it straight.
Yeah, and we'll come back. We'll come back to that and see what is said tomorrow. Thanks, Eamon.
No, thanks, Niall. Cheers.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.